Driven to Win presents The Moon of Skulls by Robert E. Howard. Chapter 1. A Man Comes Seeking. A great black shadow lay across the land, cleaving the red flame of the red sunset. To the man who toiled up the jungle trail, it loomed like a symbol of death and horror, a menace brooding and terrible, like the shadow of a stealthy assassin flung upon some candlelit wall. Yet it was only the shadow of the great crag which reared up in front of him, the first outpost of the grim foothills which were his goal. He halted a moment at its foot, staring upward where it rose blackly limned against the dying sun. He could have sworn that he caught the hint of a movement at the top as he stared, hand shielding his eyes, but the fading glare dazzled him, and he could not be sure. Was it a man who darted to cover? A man, or... He shrugged his shoulders and fell to examining the rough trail which led up and over the brow of the crag. At first glance it seemed that only a mountain goat could scale it, but closer investigation showed numbers of finger-holds drilled into the solid rock. It would be a task to try his powers to the utmost, but he had not come 1,000 miles to turn back now. He dropped the large pouch he wore at his shoulder and laid down the clumsy musket, retaining only his long rapier, dagger, and one of his pistols. These he strapped behind him, and without a backward glance over the darkening trail he had come, he started the long ascent. He was a tall man, long-armed and iron-muscled. Yet again and again he was forced to halt in his upward climb and rest for a moment, clinging like an ant to the precipitous face of the cliff. Night fell swiftly, and the crag above him was a shadowy blur in which he was forced to feel with his fingers blindly for the holes which served him as a precarious ladder. Below him, the night noises of the tropical jungle broke forth, yet it appeared to him that even these sounds were subdued and hushed, as though the great black hills looming above threw a spell of silence and fear even over the jungle creatures. On up he struggled, and now, to make his way harder, the cliff bulged outward near its summit, and the strain on nerve and muscle became heartbreaking. Time and again a hold slipped, and he escaped falling by a hair's breadth. But every fiber in his lean, hard body was perfectly coordinated, and his fingers were like steel talons with the grip of a vice. His progress grew slower and slower, but on he went, until at last he saw the cliff's brow splitting the stars, a scant 20 feet above him. And even as he looked, a vague bulk heaved into view, toppled on the edge, and hurtled down towards him with a great rush of air about it. Flesh-crawling, he flattened himself against the cliff's face and felt a heavy blow against his shoulder, only a glancing blow. But even so, it nearly tore him from his hold, and as he fought desperately to right himself, he heard a reverberating crash among the rocks far below. Cold sweat beading his brow, he looked up. Who or what had shoved that boulder over the cliff edge? He was brave, as the bones on many a battlefield could testify, but the thought of dying like a sheep, helpless and with no chance of resistance, turned his blood cold. Then a wave of fury supplanted his fear, and he renewed his climb with reckless speed. The expected second boulder did not come, however, and no living thing met his sight as he clambered up over the edge and leaped erect, sword flashing from its scabbard. He stood upon a sort of plateau which debouched into a very broken hilly country some half-mile to the west. The crag he had just mounted jutted out from the rest of the heights like a sullen promontory, looming above the sea of waving foliage below, now dark and mysterious in the tropic night. Silence ruled here in absolute sovereignty. No breeze stirred the somber depths below, and no footfall rustled amid the stunted bushes which cloaked the plateau. Yet that boulder which had almost hurled the climber to his death had not fallen by chance. What beings moved among these grim hills? The tropical darkness fell about the lone wanderer like a heavy veil, through which the yellow stars blinked evilly. The steams of the rotting jungle vegetation floated up to him as tangible as a thick fog, and, making a wry face, he strode away from the cliff, heading boldly across the plateau, sword in one hand and pistol in the other. There was an uncomfortable feeling of being watched in the very air. The silence remained unbroken, save for the soft swishing that marked the stranger's cat-like tread through the tall upland grass. Yet the man sensed that living things glided before and behind him and on each side. Whether man or beast trailed him he knew not, nor did he much care, for he was prepared to fight human or devil who barred his way. Occasionally he halted and glanced challengingly about him, but nothing met his eye except the shrubs which crouched like short, dark ghosts about his trail, blended and blurred in the thick, hot darkness through which the very stars seemed to struggle redly. At last he came to the place where the plateau broke into the higher slopes, and there he saw a clump of trees blocked out solidly in the lesser shadows. He approached warily, then halted as his gaze, growing somewhat accustomed to the darkness, made out a vague form among the somber trunks which was not a part of them. He hesitated. The figure neither advanced nor fled. A dim form of silent menace, it lurked as if in wait. A brooding horror hung over that still cluster of trees. The stranger advanced warily, blade extended, closer, straining his eyes for some hint of threatening motion. He decided that the figure was human, but he was puzzled at its lack of movement. Then the reason became apparent. It was the corpse of a black man that stood among those trees, held erect by spears through his body, nailing him to the boles. One arm was extended in front of him, held in place along a great branch by a dagger through the wrist, the index finger straight, as if the corpse pointed stiffly back along the way the stranger had come. The meaning was obvious. That mute, grim signpost could have but one significance. Death lay beyond. The man who stood gazing upon that grisly warning rarely laughed, but now he allowed himself the luxury of a sardonic smile. 1,000 miles of land and sea, ocean travel and jungle travel, and now they expected him to turn him back with such mummery, whoever they were. He resisted the temptation to salute the corpse as an action wanting in decorum, and pushed on boldly through the grove, half expecting an attack from the rear or an ambush. Nothing of the sort occurred, however. and emerging from the trees, he found himself at the foot of a rugged incline, the first of a series of slopes. He strode stolidly upward in the night, nor did he even pause to reflect how unusual his actions must have appeared to a sensible man. The average man would have camped at the foot of the crag and waited for morning before even attempting to scale the cliffs. But this was no ordinary man. Once his objective was in sight, he followed the straightest line to it, without a thought of obstacles, whether day or night. What was to be done must be done. He had reached the outposts of the kingdom of fear at dusk, and invading its inmost recesses by night seemed to follow as a matter of course. As he went up the boulder-strewn slopes, the moon rose, lending its air of illusion, and in its light the broken hills ahead loomed up like the black spires of wizards' castles. He kept his eyes fixed on the dim trail he was following, for he knew not when another boulder might come hurtling down the inclines. He expected an attack of any sort, and naturally it was the unexpected which really happened. Suddenly, from behind a great rock stepped a man, an ebony giant in the pale moonlight, a long spear blade gleaming silver in his hand, his headpiece of ostrich plumes floating above him like a white cloud. He lifted the spear in a palmerous salute and spoke in the dialect of the river tribes. "This is not the white man's land. Who is my white brother in his own kraal, and why does he come into the land of skulls?" "My name is Solomon Kane," the white man answered in the same language. "I seek the vampire queen of Nagari." "Few seek, fewer find, none return," answered the other cryptically. "Will you lead me to her?" "You bear a long dagger in your right hand. There are no lions here." "A serpent dislodged a boulder. I thought to find snakes in the bushes." The giant acknowledged this interchange of subtleties with a grim smile, and a brief silence fell. "Your life," said the black man presently, "is in my hand." Solomon Kane smiled thinly. "I carry the lives of many warriors in my hand." The Negro's gaze traveled uncertainly up and down the shimmery length of the Englishman's sword, and then he shrugged his mighty shoulders and let his spear point sink to the earth. "You bear no gifts," said he, "but follow me, and I will lead you to the terrible one, the mistress of doom, the red woman, Nakari, who rules the land of Nagari." He stepped aside and motioned Kane to precede him, but the Englishman, his mind on a spear thrust in the back, shook his head. "Who am I that I should walk in front of my brother? We be two chiefs. Let us walk side by side." In his heart, Kane railed that he should be forced to use such unsavory diplomacy with the black savage, but he showed no sign. The giant bowed with a certain barbaric majesty, and together they went up the hill trail unspeaking. Kane was aware that men were stepping from hiding places and falling in behind them. An surreptitious glance over his shoulder showed him some 20 black warriors trailing out behind them in 2 wedge-shaped lines. The moonlight glittered on black bodies, on waving headgears and long, cruel spear blades. "My brothers are like leopards," said Kane courteously. "They lie in the low bushes, and no eyes see them. They steal through the high grass, and no man hears their coming." The black chief acknowledged the compliment with a courtly inclination of his lion-like head that set to plumes, whispering, "The mountain leopard is our brother, O chieftain. Our feet are like drifting smoke, but our arms are like iron. When they strike, blood drips red, and men die." Kane sensed an undercurrent of menace in the tone. There was no actual hint of threat on which he might base his suspicions, but the sinister minor note was there. He said no more for a space, and the strange band moved silently upward in the moonlight like a cavalcade of specters. The trail grew steeper and more rocky, winding in and out among crags and gigantic boulders. Suddenly, a great chasm opened before them, spanned by a natural bridge of rock, at the foot of which the leader halted. Kane stared at the abyss curiously. It was some 40 feet wide, and looking down, his gaze was swallowed by impenetrable blackness, hundreds of feet deep, he knew. On the other side rose crags dark and forbidding. "Here," said the Black Chief, "begin the true borders of Nakari's realm." Kane was aware that the warriors were casually closing in on him. His fingers instinctively tightened about the hilt of the rapier which he had not sheathed. The air was suddenly supercharged with tension. "Here, too," the black man said, "they who bring no gifts to Nakari die." The last word was a shriek, as if the thought had transformed the speaker into a maniac. And as he screamed it, the great black arm went back and then forward with a ripple of mighty muscles, and the long spear leapt at Kane's breast. Only a born fighter could have avoided that thrust. Kane's instinctive action saved his life. The great blade grazed his ribs as he swayed aside, and returned the blow with a flashing thrust that killed a warrior who jostled between him and the chief at that instant. Spears flashed in the moonlight, and Kane, parrying one and bending under the thrust of another, sprang out upon the narrow bridge where only one could come at him at a time. None cared to be first. They stood upon the brink and thrust at him, crowding forward when he retreated, giving back when he pressed them. Their spears were longer than his rapier, but he more than made up for the difference and the great odds by his scintillant skill and the cold ferocity of attack. They wavered back and forth, and then suddenly a great giant leapt from among his fellows and charged out upon the bridge like a wild buffalo, shoulders hunched, spear held low, eyes gleaming with a look not wholly sane. Kane leapt back before the onslaught, leapt back again, striving to avoid that stabbing spear and to find an opening for his point. He sprang to one side and found himself reeling on the edge of the bridge with eternity gaping beneath him. The warriors yelled in savage exultation as he swayed and fought for his balance, and the giant on the bridge roared and plunged at his rocking foe. Kane parried with all his strength, a feat few swordsmen could have accomplished, off balance as he was, saw the cruel spear blade flash by his cheek, felt himself falling backwards into the abyss,
A desperate effort, and he gripped the spear shaft, righted himself, and ran the spearman through the body. The giant's great red cavern of a mouth spouted blood, and with a dying effort he hurled himself blindly against his foe. Kane, with his heels over the bridge's edge, was unable to avoid him, and they toppled over together, to disappear silently into the depths below. So swiftly had it all happened that the warriors stood stunned. The giant's roar of triumph had scarcely died on his lips before the two were falling into the darkness. Now the rest of the natives came out on the bridge to peer down curiously, but no sound came up from the dark void.
You've been listening to The Moon of Skulls by Robert E. Howard. Stay tuned for Chapter 2, coming soon, only on Driven to Win.